Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy? By Tim O'Brien. The platoon of 26 soldiers moved slowly in the dark, single file, not talking. One by one, like sheep in a dream, they passed through the hedgerow, crossed quietly over a meadow, and came down to the rice paddy. There they stopped. Their leader knelt down, monitoring with his hand, and one by one the other soldiers squatted in the shadows, vanishing in the primitive stealth of warfare. For a long time they did not move, except for the sounds of their breathing. The 26 men were very quiet, some of them excited by the adventure, some of them afraid, some of them exhausted from the long night march, some of them looking forward to reaching the sea where they would be safe. At the rear of the column, Private First Class Paul Berlin lay quietly with his forehead resting on the black plastic stock of his rifle, his eyes closed. He was pretending he was not at war, pretending he had not watched Billy Boy Watkins die of a heart attack that afternoon. He was pretending he was a boy again, camping with his father in the midnight summer along the Des Moines River. In the dark, with his eyes pinched shut, he pretended. He pretended that when he opened his eyes his father would be there by the campfire, and they would talk softly about whatever came to mind, and then roll their sleeping bags, and that later they'd wake up and it would be morning, and they would not be at war, and that Billy Boy Watkins had not died of a heart attack that afternoon. He pretended he was not a soldier. In the morning when they reached the sea it would be better. The hot afternoon would be over, he would bathe in the sea, and he would forget how frightened he had been on the first day at the war. The second day would not be so bad. He would learn. There was a sound beside him, a movement, and then a breathed "Hey!" He opened his eyes, shivering, as if emerging from a deep nightmare. "Hey!" a shadow whispered. "We're moving. Get up." "Okay. You sleeping or something?" "No." He could not have made out the soldier's face. With clumsy, concrete hands he clawed for his rifle, found it, found his helmet. The soldier's shadow grunted. "You got a lot to learn, buddy. I'd shoot you if I thought you was sleeping. Let's go." Private First Class Paul Berlin blinked. Ahead of him, silhouetted against the sky, he saw the string of soldiers wading into the flat paddy, the black outline of the soldiers in packs and weapons. He was comfortable. He did not want to move. He was afraid, for it was his first night at the war, so he hurried to catch up, stumbling once, scraping his knee, groping though blind. His boots sank into the thick paddy water, and he smelled it all around him. He would tell his mother how it smelled. Mud and algae, and cattle manure, and chlorophyll, decay, breeding mosquitoes and leeches as big as mice. The fecund warmth of the paddy waters, rising up to his cut knee, but he would not tell how frightened he had been. Once they reached the sea things would be better. They would have their rear guarded by 3,000 miles of ocean, and they would swim and dive into breakers and hunt crayfish and smell the salt. They would be safe. He followed the shadow of a man in front of him. It was a clear night. Already the Southern Cross was out, and other stars he could not yet name. Soon, he thought, he would learn their names. And puffy night clouds. There was not yet a moon. Wading through the paddy, his boots made sleepy sloshing sounds, like a lullaby, and he tried not to think. Though he was afraid, he now knew that fear came in many degrees and types and peculiar categories. And he knew that his fear was not so bad as it had been in the hot afternoon when poor Billy Boy Watkins got killed by a heart attack. His fear now was diffuse and unformed. Ghosts in the tree line, nighttime fears of a child, a boogeyman in the closet that his father would open to show empty, saying, "See, there's nothing there, champ. Now you can go to sleep." In the afternoon it had been worse. The fear had been bundled and tight, and he'd been on his hands and knees crawling like an insect, an ant, escaping a giant's footsteps, and thinking nothing, Brian flopping like wet cement in a mixer, nothing, not thinking at all, watching while Billy Boy Watkins died. Now, as he stepped out of the paddy onto the narrow dirt path, now the fear was mostly with fear of being so terribly afraid again. He tried not to think. There were tricks he'd learned to keep from thinking. Counting. He'd counted his steps, concentrating on the numbers, pretending that the steps were dollar bills, and that each step through the night made him richer and richer, so that soon he would become a wealthy man. He kept counting and considered the ways he might spend the money after the war and what he would do. He would look at his father in the eye and shrug and say, "It was pretty bad at first, but I learned a lot and I got used to it." Then he would tell his father the story of Billy Boy Watkins. But he would never let on how frightened he had been. "Not so bad," he would say, instead, making his father feel proud. Songs. Another trick to stop from thinking. "Where have you gone, Billy boy, Billy boy? Oh, where have you gone, charming Billy? I have to seek a wife. She's the joy of my life, but she's a young thing and cannot leave her mother," and other songs that he sang in his thoughts as he walked toward the sea. And when he reached the sea, he would dig a deep hole in the sand, and he would sleep like the high clouds, and he would not be afraid any more. The moon came out, pale and shrunken to the size of a dime. The helmet was heavy on his head. In the morning he would adjust the leather binding. He would clean his rifle too. Even though he had been frightened to shoot it during the hot afternoon, he would carefully clean the breech and the muzzle and the ammunition so that next time he would be ready and not so afraid. In the morning, when they reached the sea, he would begin to make friends with some of the other soldiers. He would learn their names and laugh at their jokes. Then, when the war was over, he would have war buddies, and would write to them once in a while and exchange memories. Sleeping, in his walking, he felt better. He watched the moon come higher. Once they skirted a sleepy village. It smelled again, straw, cattle, mildew. The men were quiet. On the far side of the village, buried in the dark smells, a dog barked. The column stopped until the barking died away. Then they marched fast away from the village, through a graveyard filled with conical-shaped burial mounds and tiny altars made of clay and stone. The graveyard had a perfumey smell. A nice place to spend the night, he thought. The mounds would make fine battlements, and the smell was nice, and the place was quiet. But they went on, passing through hedgerow and across another paddy, and east toward the sea. He walked carefully. He remembered what he'd been taught. Stay off the center of the path, for that was where the land mines and booby traps were planted, where the stupid and lazy soldiers liked to walk. Stay alert, he'd been taught. Better alert than inert. Agile, mobile, hostile. He wished he'd paid better attention to the training. He could not remember what they'd said about how to stop being afraid. They hadn't given any lessons on courage, not that he could remember, and they hadn't mentioned how Billy Boy Watkins would die of a heart attack, his face turning pale and the veins popping out. Private First Class Paul Berlin walked carefully. Stretching ahead of him like dark beads on an invisible chain, the string of shadow soldiers, whose names did not yet know, moved with the silence and slow grace of smoke. Now and then moonlight was reflected off the machine gun or a wrist watch, but mostly the soldiers were quiet and hidden and far away, seeming in a peaceful night, strangers on a long street, and he felt quite separate from them, as if trailing behind like a caboose on a night train, pulled along by the inertia, sleepwalking, an afterthought to the war. So he walked carefully, counting his steps. When he had counted to 3,485, the column stopped. One by one, the soldiers knelt or squatted down.